Welcome to the Evolve Move Play podcast. I'm your host, Rafe Kelley. At Evolve Move Play, our aim is to help you cultivate a more meaningful life and a more heroic self by reconnecting deeply to movement, mindfulness, nature, and community practices. This podcast was created to bring the best and brightest minds in all of these subjects together to better understand how we can create an empowering and sustainable ecology of practices for personal growth. If you're interested in being part of this ongoing conversation, the best way you can support us and get involved is by joining our Podcast Plus membership. By joining, you will get backstage access to our live podcast airing once a month, as well as a private question and answer session with me and our guests after the show. On top of that, you'll get access to our thriving online community where you can continue these deeper discussions with people all over the world who are just as passionate and curious about these topics as you. More details about the membership, as well as the link to get signed up, are in the description below. And whether you can join, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so that you can be notified every Monday when our episodes drop. Thanks so much for your support, and we hope you enjoy the show. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Evolve Move Play podcast. This week, our guest is Flynn Disney, and I'm really excited to share about Flynn. But first, I've got some news for you guys. We're really excited. We have opened up our retreats for this year. Last year, we had to cancel all of our retreats due to the impacts of COVID-19 and been waiting to see the epidemic come down to levels where we felt safe opening up our events. It's finally happened, and we have just 2 spots left as of my recording of this for our July retreat, and 17 spots left for our autumn retreat, which are only 2 retreats of the year. When we announce this, usually they sell out within a week. So if you're hearing this on Monday, you definitely want to jump on and hit the link in the description and make sure to jump on a call with me. We only take groups of about 20 people, and we like to talk to everyone who's going to come and make sure that they're going to be an amazing fit for the event. It's really unlike anything else you'll experience. There is, it's where we put together all of the themes that make Evolve Move Play what it is, right? It's a deep dive into movement, into moving and understanding how to take care of your body integrity, moving through the environment, exploring some of the most amazing nature the Pacific Northwest has to offer, everything from sprawling cedar trees to climbs through waterfalls to natural water slides to amazing sandstone boulders. It's spectacular. And we're also going to be playing with sticks and balls and ropes, learning to manipulate objects. We're going to be playing a lot with each other, lots of interaction, everything from contact, dance-based stuff, all the way up to mixed martial arts-based stuff, and even cooperative work. And we'll be introducing you guys to nature connection practices, to making fire, to tracking, to picking wild berries. And we're going to be having a meditative and contemplative component, really bringing together all these ecologies of practice. And there'll be storytelling and music and everything that goes into really creating an experience of deep tribal connection based around movement. So if you're interested in that, this is the time to get involved. Don't miss it. I hope to see you guys there. So my guest this week, as I mentioned, is Flynn Disney. Flynn was brought to my attention by Callum Powell from Storer, who's been a guest on the podcast as well and has become a big supporter. And he said that he thought he was one of the most interesting thinkers, and particularly talking about the topic of fear. And so I looked into Flynn's work, and I was really surprised that he and I had never had the chance to talk before, hadn't noticed each other before, because he's been around the parkour community for a long time, and he seems to be treading a lot of the same waters philosophically and intellectually that I am. He's applying things like polyvagal theory to understand fear in parkour, and looking at archetypal understandings of human psychology and how those impact how we approach our movement practice and how we get meaning out of it. So once I saw what Flynn was up to, I was like, oh man, this is going to be a really interesting conversation. And indeed, I thought it was, and I'm really excited to keep bringing Flynn on and help him get his insights out into the world, because I think there's not enough people who are deeply thinking about the philosophical aspect of living a good life and growing and having a more meaningful life as a human being, who also have a really deep movement practice and can root it in that. And Flynn is a really wonderful example of that. So I think you guys are going to enjoy this conversation very much. Without further ado, Flynn Disney. So Flynn, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's really good to have you. I feel like I've known your name for a while, and I've always been like, is that a real name?
Yeah, it stands out.
But but I wasn't really familiar with your work, and I'm not really sure if we'd been Facebook friends for a while or anything, but it was actually Callum Powell from Storer who sent me a message, and he was just sending me a message about how much he'd been enjoying the podcast. And, I was, okay, well, I was asking him what he was interested in and, kind of picking his brain. And he was like, the guy you should really have on is Flynn Disney. And he said that he has the best understanding of fear and how to approach it of anybody in the parkour community, which is really quite a claim from
It's quite a claim.
yeah, from a guy who's famous for jumping between skyscrapers, right? Mm-hmm. So I figured that'd be a good place to start. Why is it that you, of all people, are the person that Callum Powell wants to be speaking about fear on this podcast?
Yeah, wonderful. What could that possibly be? I think what I can bring to the table, which is perhaps unique, is variety. Mm-hmm. And this is a perhaps broader range of perspectives to answer this question of what is fear, how do we deal with fear. My perspective on questions like this is always a pluralistic one in the sense that I think the answer that we get depends on the question that we ask. And the way that I've come to understand fear is naturally as an embodied sense, but what that really means is, for me, is visceral. So it's really relating to the internal experiences at a, I guess you could say, interoceptive level. So we're already using quite a lot of jargon, but interoceptive in the sense of the sense of what is happening inside the body. So whether this is the sense of the heartbeat or the sense of the contraction of the gut, this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot to answer within that question. So I've studied a lot, I suppose, risk management, risk reduction, mitigation of consequence, things like this. Mm-hmm. But what I'm really interested in is the sort of guidance system of the body for dealing with danger. And so that's what we could perhaps call intuition. And that's become something quite fascinating for me with my own training and working with students and these sort of different interoceptive signals and perhaps what they mean specifically. So I can speak more about this. And these ideas are already encoded within our language. So we have something like courage, right? The root word is the heart. So this is already sort of relating to the viscera in a sense.
So in this sense, when you're using viscera, you're using it as a term for the internal organs in general, as opposed to, say, the intestines and stomach in particular.
Yeah, I believe it's correct to say the viscera referring to
all the internal organs,
the broader internal organs. Perhaps I'm being anachronistic, but
yeah,
that's okay.
I'm not 100% sure, but it'll work for us. So okay, so
it'll work.
So there's a couple of interesting things. So I think, for the audience, obviously it's very useful to be aware that essentially we're always in motor problems, right? And movement is something that, and are fundamentally interested in. There's always a perceptual component, right? What are we perceiving that's guiding our capacity for movement? And our perceptions are divided between exteroperception, right? What we see outside of us, what we perceive outside of us, what we feel, touch, smell, the classic five senses. And then the interoperceptions, right? Kinesioperception and proprioception and, perception of the state of the internal organs. And
I suppose what I'm interested in is how well do these senses represent what is actually going on?
Sure. Okay.
And what is actually going on can only really be understood in terms of what the consequences of our actions are, in a sense. So I can only really know how accurate my intuition is for jumping across this skyscraper if I succeed or fail.
Well,
so naturally, then you do that's a different question, life after death. But Yeah, so the thing that I came to explore in particular, maybe what Callum's speaking about, is the attribution of meaning to specific sensations within the body to specific sort of outcomes. So I suppose I think about it like a sort of threshold of fear, wherein if we're under this threshold, we're experiencing fear, we experience a sort of increased heart rate. Then we're in this sort of state of potential courage, where we maybe feel some resistance towards moving forward, whether this is, jumping across a space, or whether this is, go speak to the pretty girl on the subway, whatever this is. There's a threshold of fear, it seems, where the heart is the dominant interoceptive signal. And it seems that beyond this threshold, there's a point where the gut seems to be the dominant signal. And this varies hugely from person to person. And some people, like I spoke to Daniel Lillebacker about this. We'll maybe speak about that later. But and I asked him this question: if he ever experiences this sort of visceral contraction as someone who's pushed the sort of movement game further than anyone else, and he said that he had not. But I've experienced this a lot with people who are maybe not so familiar to putting themselves into this sort of risk environment, and particularly in women as well, who seem to perhaps have this sort of richer inner world, which is I think it's a very interesting perspective, that this richness of inner experience also relates to this visceral experience, which perhaps then relates to the sort of deeper levels of resolution within psychological experience. But that's again maybe a different conversation.
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff you're throwing out there that it would be rich grounds for conversation. Just to index it for the audience, there is a finding within neurobiology, I believe, that women seem to have sort of generally higher sensitivity to internal perception, right? Mm-hmm. Their skin's thinner, they have more touch receptors, I believe. There's the emotions, the hormonal association with emotions seems to peak higher in women than men, I believe, but I'm not 100% certain about this. And there's all sorts of debates around the way in which culture genders us versus how our biology kind of informs us. I'm definitely tend to think that we've we are over attributing to culture for various reasons right now, but I don't think that I know enough about this particular subject to state that with certainty. So that's an interesting thing, but I kind of want to ground it. So one thing that's really valuable to understand about emotion is that there's a level of subjectivity or cultural construction on top of an underlying neurohormonal system. And that neurohormonal system is different, like, as you mentioned, potentially between men and women, but also different potentially between inter-individual, right?
Absolutely.
So, when we talk about fear, you're mentioning the gut and the heart, and that rings true for me in an embodied sense. But also we're talking about the amygdala in particular in the brain as being associated with this sense of arousal and threat detection. And, neurohormonally, we're talking about cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and, presumably some other neurohormones. One of the things that I remember reading, and this is something that people should take with a big grain of salt, but I thought this was quite interesting, is that one finding that seems to be true between men and women is that women tend to have a longer half-life for emotions. So when cortisol rises in response to stress, it tends to take longer to essentially be depleted in the system for women in general compared to men. That's my understanding. And so risk-taking behavior is predicted basically in some sense by how quickly you can resolve, how quickly you can kind of come down from things, but also some of these neurological associations. And I believe it was that, I'm I can't remember exactly if it was the acetylcholine system or the dopamine system that was associated with essentially that experience of elation that happens directly after feeling intense fear, and that appears to be more common in males than in females. And often, like I've seen this cliff diving, and obviously there's lots of women who like cliff diving. So if you're a woman and you're out there and you're like, I love jumping and I love cliff diving, I don't know what you guys are talking about. This is just a general principle. And if you're a man and you're like, oh man, I'm shaky after this and want to puke for hours, that's normal too.
These things are probably on a normative distribution, right? Where you see some people on the other side of that.
Yeah, but what I have noticed is that more often, like I'll be out, say, cliff diving, and I feel fear, or, I don't feel as much fear as I used to now, but I'll feel fear. And I hit the water and I come up and I have this really, really strong sense of elation, right? And then I've taken particularly some of my female students and my wife and seen them go through the fear, overcome it, hit the water, and just be like shaky and white for long periods of time afterwards. Now, I have lots of female students who've also had the elation experience. But I've definitely seen more with women in particular that they've had that experience of that. So I just thought those would be interesting groundings to kind of explore.
Great nuances.
So let's look at the neurohormonal system. Let's talk about the amygdala, as well as this gut heart, which I've seen you write about, and I think is really interesting. So with that, can you go a little bit more into your model of fear and how people experience it?
Yeah. So I suppose one thing to add is that this sort of understanding of some of the intricacies of our inner experiences, perhaps through a scientific lens, perhaps through a sort of observational lens. This sort of informed compassion, I think, can be an incredible tool for teaching, for communicating, for perhaps tailoring an individual's process, or helping someone with their individual process to do what I think we're all sort of looking to do, which is to push a little bit further into that space of uncertainty. So I think there's a huge amount of value in this kind of understanding, perhaps these sort of more statistical based understandings, which we can then tailor down to the individual, of course, having a statistical idea of some tendency within the neurochemical profile of men or women doesn't mean that applies to the individual necessarily, as we know.
I kind of want to riff on that, because I think that, potentially some people will be a little bit put off by where this conversation has started, because the gender thing does tend to step on people's toes. But it brings up an argument for me for why it's actually really useful, because I think it actually informs empathy, right? Yeah. Because if I have a student who comes to me and it's a male or a female, one of the first things that I know about them is that they're a male and a female, right? That's just information. And if there are general differences, then that gives me the scaffolding of a model for that individual. And now over time, I get to say, okay, well, this part of that scaffolding is not true in this person, and I can let go of it. Yeah. But if I don't have any scaffolding, then I don't know how to respond, right? So I remember the first time that I took a female friend cliff diving, and she was shaky and white afterwards. I had no empathy at all. I was just like, what is wrong with you? Like, this is so weird. Like, come on, like all the rest of us are here whooping it up and excited and having a great time. And, you look like you're ready to puke. And I just didn't get it, right? It wasn't that I was completely unempathic, but I just couldn't map myself into her experience. And so I couldn't meet her where she was, and then ask the question of like, okay, well, let's say that cliff diving or parkour or one of these things that is fear inducing could actually have some kind of incredible transformative power for this person. My inability to get where she was coming from in that moment is actually a major obstacle to her being able to shift her experience in such a way that she has access to that. And I actually think that's why ultimately my wife ended up not continuing in parkour with me when she started, because I didn't have a model that allowed me to access her internal experience in order to understand how I could support her properly.
Yeah, exactly. The landscape of individual inner experiences is so broad that one couldn't possibly intuit how someone else feels based on how they feel.
Yeah.
It's not possible. One of the we'll speak later about the exploration group, but one of the projects that we came out of this was from a woman called Amelie Witch, who made a project on aphantasia, so the lack of an inner visualization, so inner imagery.
Yeah.
And just the compassion that can stem from understanding is in itself a huge, I think, reason, motivation to gain more knowledge about the world, because we just can't derive any knowledge about other people's, well, not much knowledge about other people's experiences from only being in our own minds and bodies. So to go back to your question, the process of dealing with fear for me is very much naturally individual. Exploring these intuitive markers with a grain of salt. These emotional markers, these are always going to operate as sort of smoke detectors. So they're always going to bias on the side of caution.
Mm-hmm.
If I feel intense fear at something, it's likely, depending on my prior exposure, that this is going to be biasing me towards a higher level of caution than is perhaps required by the situation. And I think that really makes the game interesting in a sense, because then we're trying to create this alignment between how we're perceiving the world and what is sort of most likely to happen. The process for me is a lot about simply exposure, a lot about adequate preparation, a lot about giving people the information and the tools to perceive the risk accurately, also to deal with the risk accurately. So simply having options, having this sort of extra information, this sort of gray zone between I'm either going to successfully do this or be horribly injured. That's not the situation we want. We want to be in this situation where people have the possibility of climbing the ladder one step at a time, but then also the context where if they but also the context to potentially just jump from the ladder to take these sort of larger leaps in one moment. And I think there's a huge amount of value there in, again, this sort of jump forward into the unknown. You can have, again, these sort of intense transformative experiences. And I know I've gone through a number of these experiences myself, and these deep, very deep, potentially emotional experiences are, I think, a huge gift that a teacher can give to a student or help facilitate. So.
Yeah, the experience of a quantum leap. It's funny. I don't know if this is true for you, but I have a sense that gets harder and harder as you get older in your practice, right?
It feels like it takes more actual risk to take these steps because my perception becomes more accurate.
Or it takes stepping outside of where your practice normally is.
Indeed. Yeah.
Right. Because when it's mapped well, your edge, right? And so, I mean, I think the reality is that you can't operate real far from your physiological edge. So when you experience a quantum leap, you're actually just discovering that your edge was a lot farther than you thought. Right. But the more you've practiced, and particularly the more that you've practiced a particular particular set of movements in a particular environment, the better map that's going to be, and the smaller the increments of improvement are. So those experiences of the major changes are going to come when you go to a new environment. If you're a parkour athlete, for instance, you can experience that sensation more by going somewhere you're not familiar with, or by even going to a new practice, right? Like I've had real quantum leap experiences in dance. And that's been
Right. Yeah.
like quite surprising and really interesting to experience.
Great. Yeah, it's interesting to see that some people have this, or there is a facet of training that involves not just the increase of skill, but also the willingness. This is what I would describe as boldness. So if you imagine the classic Star Trek, to boldly go where no man has gone before, boldness is that willingness to step outside of the known. And this boldness is also something that seems quite trainable. This willingness to kind of maybe go into these, what I'm describing as heart spaces, where the heart is beating intensely and you're sort of getting some resistance, but feeling pulled into the moment. That willingness to move forward in those situations is also something quite significant, quite trainable. And I think when you look at someone like Don Tommaso, who, if listeners are not aware of, I would recommend checking him out.
Yeah,
there's clearly an ability there, not just to increase in the technical, but also in sort of in the emotional, in a sense, to move forward into that heart space very far. It's quite phenomenal to see.
Yeah. I just watched the new video. If anyone in the audience hasn't seen it, you can go see Dom do a Kong front flip over a massive gap with a huge drop in a very iconic place in London. And I was thinking about that capacity to let go into those experiences recklessly. And I was wondering if Dom's ever had like a really a really major injury, because I feel like it's harder to come back and release that way, after having torn your Achilles or broken your leg, or, so I'm just curious about that, because there is always the potential that things can go wrong. And there is a sense of invulnerability that can come when you have not had it go wrong lots of times.
Dom,
and that doesn't mean
uniquely. Sorry, go ahead.
It doesn't mean that it still can't go wrong, right?
For sure.
So, yeah.
Dom is a uniquely robust specimen.
Yeah.
Someone who's very able to take a hit.
Yeah.
Where most people would consider that possibility and back away. He seems able to consider the possibility of falling, is willing to take those consequences, takes those consequences, and then is seemingly fine. So it's
I say that, but then of course, now I'm remembering when he fell off the course in China, took a 3-story drop to his face and broke his wrist. So that brings up I know that you share an interest in like Jordan Peterson's work, and one of his areas of interest, of course, is personality psychology. And I think one of the topics we're talking about here really is something like neuroticism, right? Which is, it's basically how sensitive are you to negative emotion, right? And so if you are more sensitive to negative emotion, you're going to have a bigger negative emotional spike to an injury or an impact. And that has a massive impact on whether you are willing to do the same thing again, right? It's not just the injury itself, it's the emotional, psychological response to the injury that determines the willingness to step boldly into the same space the second time.
Right. It's very interesting. You mentioned this. Something I've been considering in some detail lately is the practice of parkour actually orientating people towards a more neurotic type of behavior, because we're often practicing in this sort of concrete environment with very sharp edges, things like this, very sort of careful of each movement. And there's a voluntariness, there's a sort of consciousness that is not animalistic, that is not sort of full-hearted. It's not released. It's actually very kind of inhibited. That I'm curious if, certainly I can see this in my own practice in times where my cautiousness has bordered on neuroticism, where I've been overly cautious of avoiding risks, but then also to the point of avoiding situations that might incur risk. And you mentioned dance earlier, and I think it's quite analogous, sort of avoiding the situation where I could perhaps encounter this sort of emotional distress. Would be an example of avoiding the kind of scenario that feels risky. And yeah, it's interesting to see someone like Dom, I know personally, and I know that he's very, very low in neuroticism. He's very calm all of the time, and can kind of rock up to a spot and kind of go ham from the first moment. So I think there's a huge potential for practicing self-trust within parkour, and I don't know the literature on really personality change. I don't know how real this is. It's something we speak about a lot, but I don't know this scientific literature intimately, so I don't know how possible experts see this as to take a trait like being high in neuroticism or something like this and go through some kind of process to explore that trait or become more aware of it, or to maybe change the sort of neurochemical operating system. I don't know if these things are possible, but they're very interesting to consider.
So I have a few thoughts about that. So it's interesting that you bring up, I want to go back and first touch on the idea that we may be in training neuroticism in parkour. Because I think there is some truth to that, but then there's also the opposite pole, which is that we are literally engaging in exposure therapy, right? So one of the things that really struck me when I encountered the ideas of cognitive behavioral therapy is that parkour is basically cognitive behavioral therapy. It's motor behavioral therapy. You're intentionally exposing yourself to stressors, and those stressors become start to elicit less negative emotion, right? So you have probably thousands of jumps that at one time were a huge spike in epinephrine and cortisol and arousal hormones and potentially negative affect hormones, right? Or neurotransmitters, I should say. That now you can face completely calmly, right? So in some sense, parkour is operating as a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's teaching us to go through this process of overcoming fear, and it is mapping the world for us in such a way that less of the world is triggering of fear, right? It's the opposite of agoraphobia, right? Agoraphobia is avoiding something, becoming more afraid of it, letting it bleed into something else, and then becoming more afraid of it.
Right.
But I think there is something true in the sense that operating always at the edge of your fear does trigger something that's embodied. One thing that I've seen within both parkour athletes and martial artists is a tendency to adopt a hunch forward posture that's self-protective. You'll see this sort of kyphotic, almost fetal posture that becomes really common in both of these sports. Part of that may be biomechanical to the types of positions you're in and how you leverage them. But I think part of it is literally that you're protecting you're putting yourself in a position where your organ systems are in danger, and you're adopting a position that is defensive of those organ systems. Right. Yeah. And it's really striking to look at that in contrast to dancers and the openness and the sense of release that can happen within dance. Yeah. And I often advocate that parkour athletes try to move more like a dancer, or try to go and study that and that sensation of letting go. And I think some of the stuff that you've been doing with bringing somatics into your work and trying to increase the sense of safety through a somatic perception sort of aligns along that. So I'd be curious to have you kind of jump into your thinking around the value of operating within fear to sort of entrain the ability to deal with it versus the value of expanding capacity to feel safe.
Yeah, I think that's very much the dichotomy. Do I go out to train on that edge, or do I work on expanding my edge? I go on the edge, or do I expand the edge? So that expansion might happen not at the edge, but sort of more towards the my sort of 70% effort, let's say, rather than my 100% effort. And this question, I think, is explored interestingly through the lens of ease. So increasing ease and moving with more ease. Essentially, if we can learn to make something that was difficult easy, we can also make things that were, that are potentially more difficult in the future within that realm of possibility or comfort. So I think we can kind of expand that known territory by making hard things easy. And it's the process for this I've been finding very interesting. One of the topics we've been exploring has been this relationship between intensity and sensitivity, in the sense that when we are experiencing greater intensities, we are less able to be sensitive within our bodies. And as you sort of mentioned, there's a sort of interoceptive, exteroceptive, and the sort of space between. We know that the cortexes relating to sensation and relating to movement, or the somatosensory cortexes, act very much are coupled in some significant way. So essentially, to move with a greater refinement, we have to sense with a greater refinement. And so the idea here is that when we're experiencing these greater intensities, we don't have this capacity to sense smaller things. And a lot of the time in parkour, people just train only at the greater intensities, and so they actually neglect this opportunity to build their sort of technical capacity. It's a huge opportunity cost for this, and there's maybe what are the reasons for this, what are the incentives for this. There's a sort of performative element a lot of the time coming through, but so I think dance is often entirely orientated towards this more we could say somatic approach, this sort of like Feldenkrais inspired approach, which is really relating to
some forms of dance, let's say, because there's many worlds within dance.
There's many worlds within dance, right? Yeah, this is not my territory. And many worlds within parkour, indeed. But it seems that the focus is often relating to at least the impression of ease, or this notion of grace, of sort of moving with ease. And this has bled through into some parts of parkour, but I think that the mentality is often do things that are on the limit rather than expand the limit. And it personally took me a very long time to encounter these sorts of ideas, moving towards strength and flexibility training, these sorts of things that will expand the territory that we can operate from, to essentially, as I said, make hard things easy.
Yeah. I was reading your post about building versus exploring. And I think there's something really interesting there, but there's something in the way that you've said that and also in that post that didn't quite map for me to my model. And I'm interested to play with it, because they're both expanding your edges, right? It's just a matter of how you're expanding your edges.
Yeah.
Right. So and I think Feldenkrais, this is something that a friend of mine who's a Feldenkrais practitioner, Todd Hargrove, talked to me about. When you say have an injury, right, you can explore every way that your body can move without experiencing pain. right? And this can so essentially bring the nervous system's level of threat down, which is a lot of what we're talking about right now. And so that expands the edges of what you're capable of without actually touching the edge in some sense. And then there are times in therapy when you have to go into pain. You have to feel pain, right? So we might say that we can expand the edges of what we're capable of in ways that in some sense are about like sort of building our foundation stronger. And then there are some that are like stretching ourselves out to the edges. And one thing that is interesting to me about that is for some reason I'm struck by this conversation around style right now, right? Or who has a really beautiful technical ability. And that a lot of times the beauty of someone's movement seems to be more associated with the exploration of what is sort of within their capability. Are you familiar with Louis West?
Yes.
Yeah. Louis West talked about lateral versus vertical creativity. Lateral creativity is essentially, so let's say you're at let's say you can jump 14 feet, right? So do you just go try to jump 14 feet and 6 inches? Or do you try to find every jump that you can in every way that's between 12 and 13 and a half feet or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And that you get kind of different results from those two things. And the later seems to be the thing that builds more of an aesthetic in movement. And often athletes seem to adopt that perspective after injury. Right? It's like you go vertical until you get smashed. Right? Or you get smashed hard enough that your personal level of neuroticism shifts you to a different direction.
Yeah, I've experienced all of these things for sure.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about this because I think it's pretty much indisputable that right now that, say, Dom, I will use Dom as our archetype right here, is the best at doing big stuff in the parkour world right now. And kind of by a wide margin. Like he is maybe, he's literally on another level right now than anybody else is willing to think about. But no offense to Dom, but I don't find him to be an especially stylish mover, right?
Sure.
Like, and some of his technical aspects are not particularly beautiful, right? Like I always cringe when I watch him do a climb up.
Sure.
And I think that his capacity to not be emotionally bothered by pushing his edges makes this kind of vertical direction of pushing the game more possible for him than for other people. And I'm reminded of another friend of mine, Rodrigo Pompin. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he has one of the nicest styles. Go watch Rodrigo. And he does very exceptional stuff. But he told me once that he basically never trains when he's afraid and never has. He's still attained an extraordinary level, right? But he's always kept himself within the sense of safety within his training. And the quality of his movement, the technicality of his movement is really astonishing. I actually think I'm
counter. Go ahead.
I think I'm probably more towards Dom in some sense, right? Like I have done both, right? But I'm attracted to doing big things a lot. And it's interesting. I don't know. It's an interesting exploit. I know that on the big 5 personality characteristics, I'm like in the 1%, the first percentile for neuroticism, right? So I'm curious, where do you see yourself within that?
Probably quite high, actually. Probably
Neuroticism.
Quite like on the maybe not 99th, but that would make this interview quite difficult. But I would imagine higher than average.
Yeah, and I would say that aligns because like after I watched a bunch of your clips, right, and you have a very consistent style, right? Your movement looks very consistent and it's very much the the current aesthetic of parkour. That may be the optimal aesthetic, or it may be just what's going through. But like feet together on landing,
Right.
you know, a certain shift, it looks exactly like all the guys who have great sticks, right?
Right.
You do a lot of very technical stuff, and some of it's really big, right? Your lâchers are huge, right? And this may be just what you choose to put out, but I don't see a lot of stuff on roofs. I don't see a lot of height work. And also you're not often moving at great speed.
Yeah. I would say those things are not unrelated. I used to do quite a lot of, I would say, height exposure, finding this more mental space to train. And really when I say mental, I mean not physical, in the sense that the process would be very much sort of standing, calculating, figuring something out, almost completely still for 10, 20 minutes, half an hour at a time. Very intense. And I trained like this for a number of years, and found that, again, whilst this boldness, whilst this willingness increased, my physical capacity was not increasing, and then shifted more towards this more sort of technical style that you'll maybe see. The last time I've revisited some more kind of hearty stuff in the last few months, but several years ago now, I had rather a bad injury, which made me question my motivation for the way that I have been approaching certain things in the past, and trying to take this notion of efficiency within the process of breaking down the jump to its furthest point, which is to deal with the variables in an entirely cognitive way. So to understand and to break down these possibilities, and then to sort of move forward. So it's essentially what this would look like was part of the challenge would be to complete the jump without testing it, or with minimal testing.
Yeah.
And this got taken to its limits. I suffered a bad injury, and this led me into questioning a lot of my motivation for things very broadly. But I sort of stepped away from certain elements of at least training at height for the last couple of years. Yeah.
You're probably familiar with Dylan Baker, right? Yeah. So Dylan is probably the OG of overcoming fear in the parkour community here, and I've had some interesting conversations with him about it. And one his rule was like, it's either hell yes or it's no, right?
Right.
And he was really looking for a felt sense of hell yes very quickly in a process.
Yeah.
And so he would say that like people thought that he was fearless, but it was much more that he just had said no to the jumps that he didn't feel confident to do before people noticed. And the ones that he was ready for, he was just ready for. And so he felt that if you spent too much time sort of cogitating about a jump, you would actually sort of build the fear up.
Yeah.
Right. So there was this sort of optimal level of mental prep. Right. And, Dom comes to mind again here in this, right? If you watch that clip of him prepping for this insane thing, you'll see that, he goes through building the skill up in various other ways and prepping and attuning his body. But once he decides to do it, he rehearses the skill really not very many times. And you can see also that he stays very, very calm, right? And that's what I remember about Dylan as well. It's the same thing. But part of that is obviously, intrinsic characteristics of the personality, but part of it is a mental approach, right? Because I've adopted things from Dylan where I just, if I'm going to have to sort of fight through a lot of tension to do a jump, I just don't do it. Right. but I look for the yes that works for me in doing very high level challenges.
Mm-hmm. I think this also goes back to the earlier conversation around emotion and trusting the wisdom of the body over our cognition, which is something that's culturally not a way that we're really exposed to, not a way of being that we're really exposed to, which is a sort of perhaps recognition of the value of intuition, things like this. So there are not so many situations where it is perhaps valuable in kind of regular cultural operating system. But the experience that I had when I fell, and I went through this very cognitive process to kind of assess this jump, and I misassessed it. I sort of regulated my emotional state when I should have not regulated my emotional state. I should have kept that fear. Actually, I should have listened to it. This really spurned on this journey of exploring the work around intuition, Antonio Damasio's work on the somatic marker hypothesis, things like this, trying to gain a sense of like what is, just at the bare possible bones, ground truth, what is an emotion, what is, you know, what is this thing that everyone's sort of referencing, was actually quite unfamiliar to me. And then from this more cognitive exploration of emotion, built up a sense of, okay, here's actually what this is, here is what these signals are responding to. And I think from this we can understand that our intuition is built up by our experiences, essentially, by the sort of outcomes of our experiences. And to go back to Dom, part of his willingness likely comes from the experience of falling and it not being so bad.
Yeah,
that's something that might inform an intuition to be perhaps more willing to take risks than what one might expect. So certainly now I'm exploring a much more emotively driven, intuitive approach rather than this heavily cognitive approach that I think is sort of what I was referring to as well, driving possibly a more kind of neurotic approach to the practice that is perhaps taking us away from the felt sense, from the embodied sense, from this more sort of somatic area that I think is ultimately what we're looking for in a practice built around the idea of freedom. We're often building these traps for ourselves that we're not necessarily able to get out of. So.
Yeah, that felt sense of yes. That's such an interesting thing to explore, because you'll hear parkour athletes say like, okay, well, I can jump that far, right? Like I've done X number of jumps that are 10 feet wide and standing prees or whatever. And there's some truth to that. And I think especially as a younger practitioner, your emotions maybe are less well mapped onto what your capabilities are. And sometimes you have to break through, right? And yet the reality is that you're actually different all the time. And the context is different, right? You may tell yourself, okay, well, I've done this jump, but there's something about the jump that you may not be cognitively tuned into that's actually different that you don't realize, right? And I feel like a lot of times people get hurt when they're sort of like, oh, I've done a jump that's like this.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, I was in London, and who was with me? No, it doesn't matter. There's some fun London folks there, and one of us found this very large jump between two tree branches. It's a beautiful big oak tree, and it was like a 6-foot drop, and it was actually a 12-foot standing pre, which was, this was one of these quantum leaps in performance. I'd never done more than like a 10-foot standing pre, right? 10, maybe 10 and a half feet standing pre. and you're still dropping 6-7 feet if you come off this, but the ground's soft, but it wasn't too bad. So it was intimidating though, right? If you shinned it, and got flipped over, it was going to be a bad day. And so I did that jump, and it was great, right? It was like huge, and it felt so good to be able to do it, because it was such a jump in performance at such a late age in my career, really, And then I came back to the US, and there was a very similar sized jump that I was looking at. And I knew that I could make the gap, but I was very sort of afraid to do it. But I was like, okay, I've had this string of really high performance, and now I'm going to need to to kind of calm my body down as we go into winter. But I just want to hit this last one before I'm done.
Very cognitive process for the jump, very top down.
Okay. And I did the jump, and I made it, but the branch in London was basically, the two branches are basically parallel to each other. But the branches in Seattle were off of each other slightly, and the landing area that I was aiming at was slanted like this, and then turned into a tree trunk going straight up. So if you're listening to this on a podcast, it was slanted and turned into a tree trunk, and then behind that landing area, the branch slanted down a lot. Okay. And so I jumped, and I overjumped slightly, and I landed on the ball of my foot, and because it was slanted, my foot just completely slid out. And so all my weight came down on my heels. So I did basically a 6-foot drop, 12-foot pre to a straight heel landing.
Right.
And I literally had some level of pain in my heels for 18 months after that.
Oh, man.
I was able to get back to pretty normal practice within like a month or two, but like if I was going to do a front flip and I was going to land short, like it was going to hurt. So,
looking back at that situation, do you feel that if you had approached it from a more sort of bottom up emotive, what is my strong yes or strong no saying?
Yeah.
Would the outcome have been different?
I don't know, but here's what I realized that I wasn't accounting for, and that an intuitive signal might have sent to me, which is that the landing was much more technically complex here. And we were much further out on a branch that had the capacity to bend a little bit. So the impact on the jump in London was much less because it was taken away. Whereas this cedar branch was very short and very thick. And so it's essentially like jumping down to concrete. And that's the type of thing where I think that if you are too focused on some of the objective metrics of it, there's these things that your intuitive system is capable of recognizing that sometimes your cognitive system doesn't get.
Right.
And
again, I think these are fascinating lessons to integrate into teaching or leading people to these experiences, because perhaps if someone has never done a practice like parkour before and they don't have this sort of intuition pumps in place, then as a teacher, it's perhaps your responsibility to say, no, heavens no, don't do this. But if someone has been practicing for a while, our intuition externally is less good than we think it is towards other people's possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a huge power to giving people the space to say yes or to say no, giving people that autonomy and that sort of self-reference. So I think teaching is, in my understanding with parkour, is so much about actually having the confidence in yourself to step back, or the confidence in their own, in the sort of the wisdom of the student's body to step back. I mean, I've seen so many amazing things happen where there's this sort of battle between the top down and the bottom up, between someone swinging on a bar, having this intention to let go from the bar, someone who's very new to the practice, And I could see from where I was that they were swinging with their body totally open, which means that when they let go, they're going to just to fly out and land on their back. And the intention was purely to release from the bar, but their body would not let them do that. So there's this fascinating, as I said, sort of smoke detector, self-protection mechanism in place. And I think we can give people space to explore that. And ultimately, it's that autonomy, that agency is what people really want to cultivate. And what I see more and more is the value of curiosity. And I think there's a value in giving people the curiosity, giving people the space to develop the curiosity about actually what can I do, rather than just coming as an external coach and saying you can do this, you can do this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not so motivating.
When I'm at our big summer retreat, there's a jump that we do that's it's about 11 feet with a 4-foot drop, but over a canyon. And we give people the opportunity to take a look at this, right? And I've had quite a few students who I wasn't sure that they were ready to do the jump, right? And I felt a lot of fear as they prepared for the jump. But what I found over the years is that that what I needed to tune into is whether they're really in a deep state of yes, or whether they're in anxiety as they prepare for the jump. And that if I see the yes in them, it always comes out safely. But if I see the anxiety in them, that's what I need to talk with them through and help them learn to recognize whether there's going to be a yes or whether there's not. And that my perception of their capabilities is less important, right, than my perception of their internal emotional state and how that relates to their readiness for something, if that makes sense.
What's driving their behavior, or what's driving their desire to move forward, whether that's performance or whether that's this sort of curiosity.
So I wanted to dig into that because I feel like you have an interesting model about the felt sensations of fear and the felt sensations of maybe the felt sensations of the yes through fear that we've hinted at, but I don't think you've really laid out. So what is the difference between how do you look at heart versus gut in relationship to fear?
My hypothesis, which I've actually had some experiment for, which has been confirmed so far. So I ran a workshop in Germany where I gave this premise of the sensation of the heart as this sort of feeling of fear plus possibility, let's say, and this sense of the gut contracting is sort of fear plus or we would say fear minus possibility, fear plus apprehension. And I gave them this idea, and I said, okay, go into this parkour setup that had been arranged by the community there, and find something that elicits one of these sensations. If you can find something particularly that elicits this sense from the gut, go to do this and come back, and we'll have a conversation. And okay, so the next task was to explore, say, conquering the challenge, getting past the jump. And gave some time. People went to do this and broke the jumps down and came back. And resoundingly, the experience was that when people were faced with this intense sensation from the gut, they were not able to move forward. But when they spent time testing the jump, practicing similar movements, or just getting a feel for it, that intense gastric contraction dissipated. They felt the stronger sense from the heart, and they were able to complete the jump. So that was very consistently what was observed. The hypothesis comes from a study of the polyvagal theory, Stephen Porges's work, which I'm not I struggle with now because it's Paul Grossman, I can't quite remember. There are critiques of this perspective, so I'm not sure how factually true it is, but I think it provides a very interesting model. But anyway, that the model contains this idea that when we're in a state of we can be in a state of fear where we are still regulated, where we're still we could say grounded or safe would be the metaphor. And then in this state, my understanding is that the primary sort of afferent signal from the viscera, so the primary signal that is arriving into the central nervous system from the visceral organs, comes from the heart. And when we move beyond this threshold of fear, when we feel unsafe, when we're sort of afraid, unsafe, the primary afferent is from the intestinal region. So that was the idea that I took from exploring polyvagal. And then I experienced that a little bit, tested it out. I had one period where I was swinging from one bar to another, missed my hands, I landed flat on my stomach, and I had a very intense visceral, specifically gastric experience for 10 days after this, to the point where a car that went past me at any speed would this sort of creeping feeling up in my gut, up in my gooch, sort of down my leg, very intense for 10 days or so, and this went away. And that was also a huge sort of empathy inducing moment, because a lot of people live their whole lives experiencing this heightened visceral sense. So there are sort of three spaces, three perhaps quite broad spaces which we could map out here. One is this gastric sense, and just to give the listeners a clear impression of what that would be like, is perhaps standing on the top of a tall tower and reaching over, getting this sense of what kind of comes up through the body, through the feet, through the intestines. It seems to have a sort of negative valence to it. It seems to sort of say, come away from whatever you're doing that is making you feel like this. On the other side, we have the heart signal, which is perhaps, whether this is some apprehension, job interview, whatever it is, gets this increased heart rate. And then on the third, we have this idea of just actually this sort of neutral space, where there's no intense signal from the body. And this is also an interesting space to explore. I don't really understand the significance of this, but it seems to me that there's this space where we're actually not feeling any intense intuitive signals from the body, and it's more sort of clear. And within that is also a huge amount of possibility. When I spoke to Daniel, we can speak about this, but I posed this question to him: what was his relationship with these internal signals? And he spoke of one of the most intense moments that he's had within parkour was a moment of pure clarity. There was actually as his recollection, there was no intense beating heart or no contracting gut or anything like this. It was just a neutrality. Mm-hmm. So there are nuances to this that are very interesting, but it seems that at the least I would use these signals as an internal feedback system, so that when we're perhaps exploring a challenge or a route or a task, or really perhaps anything in everyday life, I think that the thing about training is that it's repeatable. So training is training because the action that you're doing is repeatable. So when we're going through a task or going through a movement within parkour, let's say, I can use this internal criteria as a feedback loop to measure progress.
Yeah.
So typically we're just looking at the external. Cool, yeah, I did that a little bit faster. But this is one way of asking, how did that feel? Mm-hmm. And filtering our answer for a meaningful result. And we can kind of explore that in the context of feeling more safe within what we're doing. So
Yeah.
perhaps we want to work towards this neutral space. Perhaps that's the goal. I can't really say at this point, but it's certainly very interesting to explore through this lens.
Yeah. So a few thoughts there that are really interesting to me. So on the gut versus the heart, I'm curious whether that is whether that becomes a prescriptive rather than actual descriptive, or whether it's a pattern that maybe is specific to you that then can be that a student could map to themselves and utilize, and it can be useful to them, but isn't actually say central to the experience. Are you familiar with Simon Thacker?
No.
I highly recommend his work to you. I think that you would get a lot out of it. His work's very aligned with mine, but he's really very interested in the neurobiological side, and has also studied meditation deeply and yogic tradition and internal martial arts traditions really deeply. But he did a meditation with us at a retreat on the chakras, and he made a point that was really fascinating to me, which was that the chakras are not, he believed that in the Yoga Sutras, the chakras are not described actually as objective realities, but rather they're prescriptions. They're prescriptions for how we should, they're a method for how we can specifically embody in ourselves. It's like you don't start with the heart chakra meaning this thing necessarily. You build the meaning into the heart chakra because it provides a place for you to get this embodied signal. And so there's actually an entraining of that signal to that area. And so I think that that the description of what you experience with your students could be interpreted as them discovering a pattern, but it could also be them utilizing a pattern that's given to them and being able to then resolve a pattern better through that.
It's very
and I
interesting.
think, I think that's a useful way to look at it. As I think about the gut versus the heart versus this sense of calmness, one of the first things I think about is the sense of butterflies, which is a gut feeling. But I find that is generally a feeling that is associated with promise rather than threat, right? It's that intersection of the two, right? When you approach a girl who you're interested in, or a boy if you're a girl, or well, whatever you're interested in, whatever your whatever your alignment is there, you'll have that butterfly, and that can be a really good thing. And I've listened to a lot of fighters talk about their experience of preparing for a fight, and that sense of butterflies before a fight is something that you'll hear a lot of them talk about needing. That if they don't have it, they won't perform well.
Yeah.
So that was one thought that came up for me. And then the other was, I've been listening to Andrew Huberman a lot, who I think you get a lot out as well. And he was talking about, you can think about emotions on like some very basic level as essentially indexing calm to alert and positive to negative, right? And so fear is a high alert, highly negative, right? And then excitement is sort of moving that alertness state over. And so we know that the experience that you're going to have when you're doing a big jump in parkour or a fight or something like that is going to be associated with your body producing a lot of cortisol and a lot of epinephrine, and presumably other neurotransmitter systems that I don't understand that well, right? But testosterone, dopamine, these other things are going to be happening, and they're all going to affect the felt internal state. And one of the things that Huberman talks about is that the dopamine system in particular seems to be very sensitive to subjective framing, right? So we can tell ourselves that we're enjoying something and have dopamine essentially move in the direction that we want. If there's any potential that we can shift it, right? Like if you can focus on if you can smile while you're working out, it could actually potentially change the dopamine system and move you from a state of more anxiety to a state of more excitement.
So this is more sort of narrative based,
Yes.
rather than
So I think that's just an interesting frame to think about, is like your alertness in that threat detection is going to be doing this. The other interesting thing that he talked about is the separation of, so you have the same chemical, adrenaline and epinephrine are the same, but epinephrine is produced in the brain and adrenaline is produced in the adrenals, and they don't cross the blood-brain barrier particularly. So it's possible to be in a highly adrenalized state physically and very calm mentally. Mm-hmm. And this is a really powerful tool that we can utilize.
Yeah.
So when I think about my own embodied experience of fear, there's a sense of, as I'm thinking about it now, one of the things I'm feeling is that I actually get a lot of sensation out of the palms of my hands and the tips of my fingers. The sense of sort of electricness at the palm and in the ends of my hands, right? And this feels different to me than, say, if I was really fear-based, where it would feel clammy. Does that make sense? So what I'm thinking about is the idea that I think you're really onto something, which is that having a map of the intuitive signaling and learning to recognize the intuitive signaling that is associated with what you're looking for, or that allows you to accomplish something and stay safe, is really powerful. But there might be some variation in how that physical signaling actually arises for a given individual.
Most definitely.
So I'd love to hear your response to that. But then while we're on the topic, so just so I can kind of get this series of thoughts out, in reference to the sense of neutrality, I want to draw a distinction, let's say, between equanimity and apathy.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've noticed in my practice is that when I am overtrained or overstressed, I can become apathetic to fear. And I have a sense that that's a very dangerous place to operate within. That there is a sense that I think that fear sharpens me, right? I want to feel an appropriate level of fear when I'm doing something that is higher risk or higher consequences. It's like that's an index that I'm alert enough to take on the task, right? And when I feel apathetic, that says to me that I'm actually not getting the hormonal systems to kick on that actually make my body alert enough to be tuned in and to do something well. There's also this experience I've had that's very interesting, where I've become apathetic but stayed very, very competent in my movement. In fact, it's one of the highest competency periods that I've had. But I basically had a nervous breakdown immediately afterwards. It was like the apathy was a signal that, like, the system that I was operating in was exhausted, and that if I continued to operate within it, I would break, and I did.
Were there things present in your life that were perhaps contributing to that apathy? And I ask that because when I've experienced similar things, it's also perhaps a sort of disassociation from certain emotional realities that can prompt the shutting down of intuitive signals. Because if you open up to one, you're opening up to all of these other possible feelings that we might be pushing aside.
I don't remember super well, but if I remember correctly, it was a period of a lot of professional success. And my relationships were okay. There have been some underlying stressors on my relationship and my marriage, but that was quite distant from me because I was on the road and not, like I may have had a little bell ringing in the back of my mind that my relationship with my wife was suffering because of the time that I was on the road. But my seminars were all sold out when I was in Europe, and it was it was an extremely successful trip. And it was literally just the volume of work that I had done was unsustainable, right? And I had some underlying health problems that were creeping up and not addressed.
Yeah, it's an interesting line where the possibility that some denial of the self can actually be correlated with an improvement in performance, and there's a sort of idealism that peak performance is associated with some sort of whole emotional state, but that's not always the case. So it's just an interesting perspective. One perspective there as well with so was there anything else you wanted to say on that? I was going to switch topic.
Yeah, so I wanted to just propose this idea that sense of clarity might be better mapped to something like equanimity. And equanimity would be the attribute of essentially having the mind be very calm in relationship to the passions. And this is different from not experiencing the passions, I think, right? So you can imagine that you're that you come to a place of better calm, right? And that allows you to operate with clarity. But when the emotional signaling is not there, you don't actually operate with clarity, right? You're blind to incredibly powerful information, right? So it's more about the mind, in some sense, being more centered, perhaps, is a good way to think about it. And I think about the Stoics in relationship to the cultivation of this. And one thing that I've actually found, which has been quite interesting in my practice, is that I do metta meditation, loving kindness meditation, and I've found that actually is the best place to create the mental state that I want to map in to doing high level, high risk parkour.
Yeah.
Because I have this sense that if I'm coming up from a place of deep love for myself, one, I'll experience more joy in doing things, but also I won't do things that are going to potentially hurt me, because that wouldn't be loving to myself. Right. And that if I'm not intentionally sort of accessing these places from that emotion, that there's this potential for the pursuit of high performance to actually be driven from a self-destructive place.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I've seen that actually quite a bit in the parkour community. I think that it's not talked about nearly enough, that there are people who are flirting with death because they are actually deeply suffering in their day-to-day existence, and they are and they're getting massive praise for what they're accomplishing physically, while they're, I think, potentially in training emotional states that are extraordinarily destructive for them. So balls in your court.
No, it's wonderful that you mentioned this. The state of, what we could say, moving from love is it's sort of very easy to dismiss within this we could call this sort of rationalist or sort of new atheist kind of paradigm. But my experience certainly with this is that when I not through loving kindness meditation, but just through loving kindness, feel this intense connection to feeling love for myself. These are the moments where I'm at ease, I'm trusting myself, I'm willing to push to the edge of my ability, not in a self-destructive way, not even in an effortful way, but able to sort of push myself with ease. And I was thinking, reflecting on this just the other day, that it would be wonderful to find a way to sort of trigger this state. So yeah, a practice of metta is an interesting way to do this. And this also brings us on to perhaps Christianity. My understanding of some of this philosophy is largely based around this notion of love and
Yes.
love and acceptance. And so I think it's not a coincidence that Daniel, who we've referenced a number of times, maybe I should say explicitly, is
yeah. Sorry, I think you were going to do it, but I was just going to clarify. For those of you who are not familiar, we're speaking of Daniel Ilabaka. If you're more new to the movement community, you may not actually be familiar with Daniel, but I think it would be fair to say that Daniel set the standard for skill in parkour in the middle aughts. And yeah, there's elements of the way that Danny moved that I'm not sure anyone has yet leveled up to. And that's the stuff that I've seen on film. And I've heard stories in the background of the things that Danny accomplished that sound like superhero missions. So he's quite an interesting person from the sense of what he's accomplished physically. But it's also very interesting to me that he somehow found something in Christianity that I guess was related to parkour and what he was seeking in parkour, because I think that at the time, parkour was really dominated by the new atheist perspective. And I was certainly in that camp at the time. So it's a very different thing. But I think there's something almost insipidly spiritual about parkour. And so Danny was like a leading indicator also of, where a lot of us would go in seeking to understanding the meaning of life through our practice, I guess. So that's my attempt to introduce Danny to the audience. So go ahead.
Sure.
Hopefully that was useful.
Yeah. So the context that we brought that up in Daniel's relationship to Christian philosophy, and again, I want to make it clear that I can only speak about this. I can't give an embodied sense of this because my own belief system is not embodied in the Christian sense. I am not embodied in the Christian sense, so I can perhaps only glimpse at what some of these individuals feel regularly. And I think it's sort of what was referenced with this notion of loving kindness and acceptance. My understanding of this is, and I would love to hear your perspective on this, as I no doubt will, that the root of strength of Christianity is this being who made the ultimate sacrifice, who loves you and accepts you. And I think if you can even have a notion of what that is like to feel loved unconditionally, to feel loved wholly, that's really something. And it seems like not a coincidence, that Christianity has sort of evolved to be the dominant religious philosophy, and also that Daniel has evolved to be the mover that he is, having this perhaps sort of landscape, being enmeshed in this landscape of acceptance, of love, as a sort of launch pad to move into other things from. This sense of being held, having a sort of a bedrock. Like they really describe. I have another Christian friend who practices in a similar way to Daniel, and he says, Jesus first, then my wife, then my child. I'm not sure about the order of those two, but it's Jesus first, and that's very unintuitive for sort of like secular mind. So it's very interesting to me. So I've been trying to understand this over the last period of time. I think, like you mentioned, Daniel's philosophy is sort of opened up a lot. We had a conversation recently, and I felt very accepted by him. I didn't feel like sort of persecuted for my atheism in any way. So I think he's really matured in this sense, and it's just fascinating to see that there's this relationship between perhaps it is, going back to what we mentioned earlier, this willingness to move forward into those unknown spaces with the knowledge of being held, being accepted. There is a greater possibility to step outside of what one has done before, because one will be safe. So there's a sort of safety in this. So I'm interested to hear what your perspective on this is.
Yeah. Have you studied John Vervaeke's work at all?
Not extensively, no.
Yeah, I highly recommend that. And I've had 5 conversations with him, and it's funny because my last conversation was Paul Vanderklay, who's a Christian pastor. So I was thinking, and here we're going back to the safe ground of movement, but now here we are talking about Christianity again. Through Jordan Peterson, I really developed an incredible respect for the Christian idea of logos, right? As an orienting principle, right?
My understanding of that is something like pulling order from chaos.
Yeah, that's how he would describe it. Logos is, obviously the root of logic, and it's the word, right? And the idea is that through the pursuit of truth, we can say bring good into being, right? And that truth is the truth of logos, let's say, contains something more than simply the objective truth that is described in Christianity, in science, right? It's a principle that maybe orients us even more deeply than that. And then through John Vervaeke, I came to really understand the meaning of agape and the power of that and why that's so powerful. So agape, I think there's something like 7 terms for love actually in Greek, at least koine, which is the Greek that was spoken at the time of Jesus in the Near East. And but there are 3 primary ones. And the 3 primary ones are eros, philia, and agape. And eros is the love that seeks to become one with or seeks to consume. So sexual love is erotic, but actually so is wanting to eat a chocolate cake, right? Philia is the love that seeks reciprocation, right? It's the love of brotherhood. It's the love of, I scratch my back, you scratch yours. You expect that what is given will be returned in kind. But agape is the love that is given, that is forgiven, that is given without expectation of return, that is given because by giving it, you allow something to come into being. So the analogy is the love that a parent has for a child, right? Love, you don't love the child because you want to become one with it. Hopefully not. You don't love the child because you expect to get an equal return from your investment in the child. You love the child because by loving the child, you allow it to come into being. You participate in the magic and the majesty of being by giving that child love. And what Christ asks of us is to essentially love everyone that way, to place that as the most important and highest principle in our life. And so I think if a Christian, for instance, says that they put Christ above their wife, what they're saying in some sense is that they place that principle as the most important principle. And I think that when you frame it that way, it becomes more powerful and more understandable from an outsider's perspective. So when Christ says, love thy neighbor, he uses the term agape, or love thy enemy, even thy enemy, right? He uses that term. And symbolically, you can think of Christ as representing someone who can see that we are all flawed, sinful human beings, right? And I think that, we don't like this term anymore, but I think that it's actually really powerful. Like to sin is an old archer's term. It means to err. It means to miss the mark.
Miss the mark. Yeah.
Right. And so let's say that we all miss the mark. We all inevitably miss the mark. We all inevitably fall to corruption and here and there. We all inevitably, we make mistakes. And those mistakes can be incredibly costly to ourselves and to others. And so Christ is someone who says basically that's true. And yet I see within you the divine potential to bring the world into a better place. Mm-hmm. And I will die so that that is possible. Mm-hmm. All right. I will. Yeah, that's the idea, is that he's willing to die, to be tortured, so that the rest of the world can bring good into being. Mm-hmm. And so, in some sense, to worship Christ is to say to yourself, that's the principle that I want at the highest. And so I would say that I agree with that. I don't believe in the literal truth of the biblical story. There are some things about the Bible that I'm sure are not true, right? I wouldn't say that I'm sure that the resurrection is not true, but I will say this, that I don't think that within the scientific materialist frame, mm-hmm. that we will ever be able to justify that it happened, right? We'll never be able to say that it is scientifically true that Christ definitely rose from the dead. Mm-hmm. But I also think that we actually can't say that it's not true either, right?
Yeah, I would say it has a low probability, but again, it's like,
sure, but it's not. Sure. We cannot completely falsify it. We can only say that from a scientific perspective, it's unlikely.
We can't falsify.
It's very unlikely, right? And so I'm comfortable with both of those statements, right? But I think that once I discovered that, I've slowly come to put that as the most important principle. Mm-hmm. And so within, people have been talking about, you've been doing parkour for 14 years? Mm-hmm. Okay. So do you remember the forums? Were you involved in the forums?
This was, just the
you were a child, right? But I was involved in like the parkour.net forums and urban free flow and all that stuff. And we used to talk all the time about parkour philosophy and how important the philosophy was and how parkour was really all about the philosophy. But fundamentally, nobody actually knew what the philosophy was or could really describe it. It was incoherent, right? Like everyone talks about être fort pour être utile, right? Like be strong to be useful. But that's the motto of méthode naturelle, and wasn't something that the founders of parkour even knew about until after it had already spread. Right, as far as I understand, the actual motto of the parkour group, or at least the traceurs, as far as I know, was être dur, right? To be and to last. Mm. So the founding fathers of it were really young when it spread, right? They were all in their early 20s when it spread. So many of them were not super highly educated. And it spread in a language that wasn't their language outside of most of them, right? So this idea of the philosophy of parkour was something that I think was deeply attractive, and there's something that comes up internally for the practitioner in doing it, but it wasn't really described. Mm-hmm. So when I discovered Jordan Peterson, it was like I thought that he was talking about what we would really been doing, right? That essentially this was the confrontation with chaos, that we were going out to find our dragons and slay them. And it seems like you've come to the same conclusion based on some of the stuff you've written.
Sure. Yeah. One point there as well is this notion of efficiency, which I find to be particularly interesting and quite unique to parkour. And I don't know if you're aware of Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti, who had a remarkable influence on parkour through the lineage of Bruce Lee, who influenced David and these guys. But this seems to
Seb in particular.
Is that right? Krishnamurti? Oh, Bruce Lee.
No, Seb. Right. Seb's the big Bruce Lee guy, right?
Right, exactly, yeah. And Bruce Lee was, when you compare some of his philosophy to Krishnamurti's, it's like, okay, you just sort of like switched some of the words around here. So there's a very direct line from someone who is one of the most interesting thinkers of the 20th century, and quite a rebel in his own right as well. having this influence on parkour. And the line there that I understand with efficiency is also present within Christianity to a degree that I don't really understand. It's something that I've heard Daniel mention a number of times. He said Jesus walked through the mountains, this sort of thing. So this ability to speak directly to the heart, to effectively not mince words, to speak in a way that communicates directly with the heart or with the soul of the person. There's also a sort of notion of efficiency. And I think within Krishnamurti's idea, it's really just a sort of abandon ideology, abandon useless ideas. Truth is a pathless land. Sort of don't waste your energy. It's very much a core part of his philosophy, and that is obviously could be seen in Bruce Lee's work. And so it's for me, the principle within parkour that I've always connected to most clearly is this idea of efficiency. I think also has some quite interesting sort of spiritual connotations of again not wasting energy. And then you have to ask, not wasting energy towards what? And then maybe that's a different conversation, or maybe it's the same one.
Well, what pops up for me is perfection is not reached when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to remove, right? And so I think that we often are trying to acquire, right? We're trying to bring in, we're trying to expand our knowledge, expand this, expand, and we don't recognize that that removal is also really, really important, right? Right? Even in growth, right? You cannot live unless the cells that are dead are eaten. But this necessity to allow aspects of the self to die seems to be harder to internalize, right? Nassim Taleb talks about via negativa, right? The negative life, the life that arises through cutting away all that is unnecessary. Jordan Peterson talks about, like, how do we burn off the deadwood of our character, right? This is part of what we go to parkour for, is as a place to burn off the deadwood of the character. So I think that balancing of those two aspects is a really powerful aspect of understanding real self-transformation. Yeah.
And I think that this is in itself an incredible recipe for self-transformation or self-actualization. But again, the question of for what comes up.
Well, so that's I don't know. I'll tell you what I've come to through Peterson and Vervaeke and various other influences. But so I came through encountering Peterson to the idea that essentially, like, what parkour was about was the cultivation of a heroic self, right? It was about I actually think that the movie Fight Club is an extraordinarily insightful thing to understand the rise of parkour, right? That essentially the problem that Tyler Durden lays out is the problem that people who adopt parkour are answering, right? It's this problem of the hedonic treadmill and apathy and meaninglessness in life, right? And it's like, well, how do we start to create our own values? And I think that parkour is essentially a rediscovery of play, right? That's one aspect of it. And it's about the element of play that is about risk-taking and going to your edge, and then being able to confront something that is undiscovered potential and to bring something out of it. So then I started to ask myself, well, what is the heroic individual? And part of this comes out of reading Maps of Meaning and Peterson's work, but we ended up with these different categories of, you have to have vision, right? So this is represented by Horus, the Egyptian god, right? The capacity to see. Marduk, right? The Mesopotamian god, has eyes all around his head, right? In order to confront a problem, you first have to be able to recognize that there is a problem, right? To not be blind to it. The second aspect of it is that you have to be able to then articulate the nature of the problem, right? This is represented by, the capacity for speech, by you were writing about this recently, right? Like that words give us a capacity to conceptualize a problem in a way that is much more difficult without words.
Yeah.
And so there's something magical about that, right? And that's represented in many different traditions, right?
Yeah. So also in the animal world.
Yeah. So then, you could look at that as someone like Socrates, right? As the power of words, or whomever you choose. And then there's the capacity to emotionally handle the problem, right? Can you stand in the face of the problem with equanimity, right? And I like the Buddha as an exemplar of that. And then there is the physical strength to confront the problem. You have Hercules or Thor or something like that. And then there's skillfulness. Do you have the specific skills to accomplish it? And I like the Celtic god Luke as a representative of that. So these are the elements of the hero in our perspective. So I laid these all out, and I had this recognition that actually someone could have all of these and be evil, right? That to achieve greatness, or you might even, in the old sense, what we're talking about is virtue, right? In the Latin sense of the word virtue, right? This is what it's describing. It's this capacity for action, right? Like, in that sense, Genghis Khan is virtuous, right? He has an extraordinary capacity to change the world. Even Hitler, you could say, is virtuous, right? His greatness was turned to evil, but he was not an insignificant human being, right? And the difference between the heroic individual and the monster is essentially where their capacity for greatness is directed. So having the capacity for greatness and cultivating that alone doesn't make the world a better place necessarily. It only produces the potential to make the world a better place. So to make the world a better place, you actually have to put yourself in relationship to the highest principle. And the highest principle that I've been able to discover is that principle of agape. And I think that is extraordinarily beautifully symbolized in the Christian story. But I would also say that it's extraordinarily beautifully symbolized in the Buddhist story. You could say that that Christ is the example of a man who was willing to die that the world would be redeemed. And Buddha is the man who is willing to forego enlightenment to come back to the world that it may be redeemed. So there's a weird inversion but parallelism of the two stories, because Buddha goes and experiences the nirvana that he sought, and he recognizes that he has the capacity to be in nirvana forever, but that the rest of the world will be left behind. And so he has to go out and show people how to get there. And I think that those two examples are extraordinarily profound teachers.
Yeah. One, I really resonate with all you said here. One, so I'm always thinking really in the context within this sort of meaning context of the sort of average person.
Yeah.
Like, if the world is to change, it changes through the average person. And
I'm not sure that's true, actually.
Well, in a sense, the people who are listening to this conversation, a lot of them are going to be outliers in the sense of just like statistical outliers.
Yeah.
They would have these interests. And I think that the way that the world has changed for the worse has changed through the average person sense. That the cultural influences that we're being fed, which are taking us really out of the context of possibility that we occupy, the potential for love without the need for reciprocation, or for the actualization of our own possibility, or to the service of others, whatever it is. The cultural values that we're meeting, that we're being fed, are very much not in that direction. And so again, I find it's very important to relate all of these conversations into the average person. And the thing that I think is the most powerful emotively, and it's something that you'll see within, to my knowledge, all sort of world religions, is mystery. And I think we also need to offer, or there needs to be the offering of mystery. So just one anecdote here. There was a children's book that I read when I was young, and there was one moment where there's sort of the characters have found the thing that they're looking for, and the baddies and the goodies are united and all of this, and then they're in the submarine, and then they see on the radar this big question mark appear, and everyone starts freaking out, and there's one person who knows what it is, but they're not going to tell anyone. And it's really intense, mysterious moment. And I still think about that from time to time. It just sort of pops back in my mind. So this to me speaks of the sort of primacy of mystery and how interesting mystery is. And then we could also relate that to the orienting response, which I know Peterson's done a lot of work on, this sort of this sense of exploration, this sense of motivated approach and curiosity that derives from recognizing something that is sort of, maybe the outline is vaguely familiar, but we can't really see the details, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not so unfamiliar that we're afraid, but it's unfamiliar enough that we're interested to approach it, something like this. And so I think within this sort of integrated scientific, spiritual, sort of secular philosophy that I believe we're discussing, I think we also need something of mystery, and I suppose that could be, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what that mystery is for the average person. Something like the maximization of potential and the minimization of harm. But I don't know if that's sort of sexy and interesting enough, or sort of symbolic enough. Perhaps you have the symbolism for this, but even then, it's like this ancient symbolism. I'm not sure if it sort of meshes with the modern mind.
Mystery. I want to grab onto that. I think there's something very interesting there. I think that a lot gets blamed on Descartes, and I don't want to pile on, and I don't understand his work quite well enough to make this claim with certitude. But I have this sense that Western culture in particular has been addicted to certainty, right? And certainty is actually the closing off of the world to mystery, and that without mystery, there's no capacity in some sense for the transcendent. And that this has been very spiritually poisonous to us, right? And I often mention this book, and the more that I think about this book, the more that I think that like everybody really needs to read it. It's a difficult book, but I think that it is so symbolic and resonant with what we are talking about, which is a book. It's a series of books called The Second Apocalypse by R. Scott Baker. Right? And essentially, Baker says that if God is dead, then fantasy is his graveyard. Right? And it's within the world of fantasy literature that essentially we get to revisit a world where meaning is literal. And this is what attracts us to Tolkien and Lewis and then all of their descendants. But Baker's take on that is that we feel deeply unmoored from the sense of meaning, and that this is really disturbing to us. But that if we look back at the Old Testament, if we look back at the Greek gods, if we look back at Vedanta and all these things, what we find is actually something horrific. Right? And so he wants to take us into a world where all those things are literally true, right? Where men are spiritually superior to women just because the gods like men more than women. And snakes are spiritually superior to pigs because the gods like snakes more than women. And this is just arbitrary. It's just the nature of the universe, which is arbitrary for no good reason, right? And so he gives us the world of world-born men, which is essentially like almost like Bronze Age, the Bronze Age Near East and Greece, right? And then he gives us a group of monks called the Dunyain, who essentially have studied the principle of causation for 2,000 years and engage in a series of eugenics to create perfectly logical people. And in some sense, they represent modernity.
Mm-hmm.
And then he gives us the Inchori, who are these aliens who have crash landed on the planet. And they represent, in some sense, something like postmodernism and the collapse of all value systems to hedonic pleasure. And their goal becomes the closing off of the world to the outside, right? They realize that their pursuit of hedonic pleasure means that they are damned in the eyes of the gods. And so their reaction to that is to close the world off to the gods. And so what they've realized is in order to do that, they have to kill everyone but 144,000 people, which I think is probably something symbolic about the ideas of the elect in Calvinism. I'm not really sure where he got that number from, but something, I'm sure it's something like that. So read the books and then we'll talk about them because I need to talk to people about them. But I think that, Baker is really playing in the same sandbox as Peterson and Vervaeke. Mm-hmm. And ultimately he doesn't have a good answer, but he's asked all the most brutal questions. Mm-hmm. And grappling with the questions that he's put forth in the symbolic way that he's done is extraordinarily powerful. Mm-hmm. And then read it in contrast to Peterson and Vervaeke, and you start to see, okay, how we can map a way out, yeah. I think. Yeah. But so there is, and within modernism, let's say, this desire to close the world to mystery, to create, the idea within Descartes was something like being able to see the world as, like, the principle of causation says that what comes from before determines what comes after. If you understood everything that came before, then you could understand everything that comes after, right? And so then all mystery would be disappointed. If you have a grand unifying theory of physics, then essentially everything should be predictable at some point.
Yeah,
that's the idea. Yeah, but it doesn't actually seem like that's the way that the world works, because what we discover with quantum physics is at the very bottom of reality is uncertainty, mm-hmm. right? That all we have at the most basic level is probability. Mm-hmm. And that then we have this thing of emergent characteristics as we move up layers. And so now reductionist science has sort of, in some ways it's run its ground, right? Like we haven't made major discoveries in physics since basically the 1960s, right? We are stuck, right? And we're still, like, technology is basically still just cannibalizing the discoveries of Albert Einstein and, and Niels Bohr and all those guys, von Neumann and Feynman. But string theory is not producing new insights that allow new technologies.
Right. Yeah. Well, right. in that sense, in that sense, Eric Weinstein is something of a myth maker, right? Because he's saying he's sort of making the sacrifice of ridiculing himself and putting geometric unity out, which I haven't read, but there's a real call to action there. Like I'm working on a sort of theory of everything for learning at the moment, and I feel very inspired by that willingness to come from a not strictly academic background and put myself out there and take that risk. And I think that sort of gift of agency is something that we need, particularly Eric as well, because he has this sort of autodidact respect for the autodidact narrative, and you've seen his spiel on Kung Fu Panda, things like this. It's like relating the gift of agency, the gift of self-teaching as the thing that allowed Poe, the Kung Fu Panda, to transcend, like this sort of, and then relating this to I don't know, Hendrix and whoever else, these Richard Faraday, all of these Michael Faraday, musicians and scientists who were groundbreaking, who came from a non-institutional background. So there's some really interesting questions here. I've been exploring this a bit with this idea of the orienting response, and this idea of Jack Sparrow's broken compass, being the compass, that it doesn't take you where you think you should go, but it takes you where you want to go. And it's like, maybe those are sort of contrasting, but it seems that the thing that you most deeply want to learn about will also harness the process most suited for learning. So that process of sort of dopaminergic and acetylcholinergic, I don't know what the word is.
Yeah.
Processes of
acetylcholinergic.
Cholinergic. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, cholinergic. These processes that actually I haven't studied this for a little while now. I can't remember, but essentially the processes that are suited for learning through error and learning through approach, learning through positive and negative feedback loops. And that seems to be the association between the two. Is dopamine is a positive feedback loop, keep doing the thing that you're doing.
Yeah.
Acetylcholine is a negative feedback loop, retreat and regulate. And this sort of emotive process through this neurotransmitter gateway. It's like
so if you jump off a cliff and you get you get a shot of dopamine along with epinephrine and cortisol, then you want to do it again. You get too much acetylcholine, then you're like, okay, that was enough.
Yeah, you need to like regulate.
Yeah, retreat, regulate.
Save yourself.
I'm not certain, but that might be what I was reading, which is quite interesting. So, yeah, and sorry, I'm all over the place, but I was just thinking, Dom falls on his face from 3 stories and gets a hit of dopamine, and everybody else doesn't, right? And that's what explains, in some sense, the ability of some people to move in this direction more easily.
Like you mentioned earlier, and this relates to the theory of learning that I'm creating or accumulating, is that the narrative you believe determines the world you perceive. So it's like 2 people go through the same experience. One has a different belief system or a different story or a different goal. Depending on that goal, the experiences will be interpreted differently. And then this is also the sort of like what I understand of the sort of Jordan Peterson's idea of meaning.
You can say Petersonian. We use it all the time.
We can say Petersonian. Sort of meaning is valence. Meaning is do I want to move towards this or away from this? And that existence is dependent on a goal. So if you don't have a goal, you don't have a sort of biological valence. You don't have a sense of good or bad if you don't have a thing that is relative to. So it's interesting. I don't know what Dom's like kind of greater like telos is, or I'm sure, I don't know if he's like thinking in this context, or he's just sort of like, he's why he's able to maybe like take such a hit and come back and not go into this. It might just be a personality thing, a sort of biological thing, but it's a frame of reference that is extremely important, because it's going to determine the quality ultimately of our experiences. And I think it is a huge power in parkour and a lot of these practices, saying that you've gone into some hardship. What can you take away from this? And post-traumatic growth, this sort of idea is like also very much related to this, like the narrative you believe determines the world you perceive. It's like, okay, I can go into this experience and not be overwhelmed by it, or if I am overwhelmed by it, I can observe something in myself. And so it's interesting to put that in the context of Dom falling 3 stories onto his face.
It's funny. I just wanted to mention that I like felt the ghost of Eric Weinstein on my shoulder as I was talking about physics, and then he picked it up. So that was fun. It's fun to have a conversation with someone who's conversant in these things.
I've had a couple of those as well in this conversation. So it's nice.
I wanted to go back to this idea of mystery for a second, because I wanted to bring Vervaeke in again, and I highly recommend that you dig into Vervaeke. But one thing that's come up in some of the conversations that he has is they use this terminology of the suchness and the moreness of being, which is it's very difficult, right? But the idea is that that the sacred or the divine, right, always has this sense of inviting us forward and retreating from us, so that there's always more for us to see, right? And that essentially anything that taps into the sacred has this characteristic, right? And so he would describe like our experience with parkour, if it's really done right, is a sense of the sacred, right? Because we go to the place that we've gone over and over again, and we discover something new, something more, and the ability to completely conceptualize what's possible keeps getting blown up, right? There's always more, right? And this allows us to stay within the process of transformation, or to map it to the Peterson model. It's like we can continually access that approach motivation system and that making meaning out of the world. And that's fundamentally what we like, right? You might say that a human being is in some deep essence a meaning maker, and maybe this is rooted in that orienting instinct, right? So the way that I like, I think people don't take seriously enough the idea of human nature, right? Mm-hmm. And that's actually, like, when I talk about evolved move play, the first fundamental principle is that human beings have a nature, and that by understanding it, we can better live, right? We can live more meaningful lives. Mm-hmm. And then an assumption about that is that actually a human being is something that wants to transform themselves in a positive way. And that there's an archetypal self, right, that represents the highest potential expression of who you are, and that movement towards that self is intrinsically meaningful. Mm-hmm. And so you should do that. It's not the only source of meaning, right? Like we could talk about the serotonin system versus the dopamine system, right? Mm-hmm. The dopamine system attracts us forward, and the serotonin system gives us the sense of well-being where we are. And we actually want both of these systems to be activated in our life. Right. And so I say that when someone has the right movement practice, right, and the right set of practices, it orients them within the experience of being such that it is better right now, right? That you are connected deeply to what is meaningful, which is the body, the self, the mind, right? Like this thing that you're in. What is the relationship between all the parts of it? How do they integrate? How is the experience of it? And then the environment that we move through. And for me in particular, the natural environment has so much more richness and offer of connection for us. And then the social environment, right? So movement, mindfulness, nature, and community. These are the fundamental bases for what we are. So we can have a practice that says, right here in this moment, I am experiencing these things in a better way, right? And then we can also have a practice that says, I come back to nature and I understand it more deeply. I am able to move through it with more mastery. Mm-hmm. I go into solitude and I come back to community, and my community is stronger, and my capacity to communicate is stronger, and my capacity to love and feel loved is better, right? And my capacity for mental clarity, all those things, that's essentially what, that's essentially what I think it's all about.
Yeah, there's a really interesting perspective that I think is a great criticism of some of the kind of maybe postmodernists. Everything's sort of relative, or everything's constructed. That we are deeply co-evolved with the universe reality that we occupy. Mm-hmm. And this can be seen, one sort of entry-level analogy for this would be perhaps the vestibular system, which is made of these three semicircular canals. It seems to represent the three planes of motion, or maybe there's more, but very roughly. And so there's this connection there, just a simple example between the outer world that we occupy and the inner apparatus. And then there are many other examples of this, like the length of the synapses communicating information at a distance. So we perceive light and we know that that thing's over there. In a universe with perhaps 2 dimensions of movement, the vestibular system would be shaped differently, or the synapses would be 1 point. So it's like just those analogies to say, okay, so we're we're not external to. That's sort of the narrative. The popular narrative is that we're sort of been plopped into existence, but we're very much part of it. The question then is, how deep does that go? And then, so I think,
to me, it goes all the way.
Yeah, right. Well,
right.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, this is like maybe somewhat tangential, but it's sort of illustrative. I'm very deeply skeptical of transhumanism, and like one of the, I had a conversation with one of my best friends, the guy I started parkour with many years ago, and we were talking about like the problem of grand narrative, right? Like the Christian grand narrative, we're maybe living in its ghost, but it's sort of collapsed, and then the question is, what do we do? Are we able to recover it and go back to it and bring it back in a way that it works now? And that's maybe what Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson and Paul van der Klee are trying to do. Or maybe we move past narrative and move into a practice and a way of connecting to self-transcendence that's less dependent on narrative. And that's something like John Vervaeke. But what I see a lot of people doing is replacing these narratives, right? I feel like, critical theory inflected social justice has in many ways sort of it's falling into Christian symbolism and repurposing it, right? So that, there's a reason that at Black Lives Matter protests, right? Like white people are washing the feet of Black people as a signal of the sin of white privilege, right? Like that's all
symbolism happens.
It's the symbolism, right? But let me continue for a second.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Because I don't want to get too deep into politics. What I wanted to get to is actually was the idea that one grand narrative that a lot of people are attracted to, and this is what Eric Weinstein is at, is getting off this planet, right? The idea is that the singular purpose is to sort of seed the universe with human life, and that can provide it. But I don't think that you can be a human and not be an earthling.
Right.
I think that human beings might be able to seed the universe with aliens that have human DNA and human ancestry. But I think that our psychology, our neurology, our physiology is so built for this place that any version of a human being that survives on a different planet is going to have to be so radically altered that we wouldn't recognize them as the same thing anymore. And that the problem of life on Earth will go on no matter if they exist or not. It's like we won't have solved how to behave as Earthlings because there are now Marslings, right? Marslings will be very, very different from us, and they will have some of the same problems that we've always had. And then they'll have some other set of problems that have to do with the way that you have to neurologically, psychologically, and physiologically be adapted to this new environment.
Yeah. Right.
So, I was talking to someone online about this, and they were saying, humans will have an interstellar civilization. Like that will happen. And I was like, that's just a statement of faith, right? You've just replaced the kingdom of heaven with interstellar civilization, right? And you're still desperate for a grand unifying narrative. But I actually think in some sense, getting people to operate from a deeper sense of love and a deeper understanding of the truth is more realistic than intergalactic civilization.
Yeah.
And it
totally
does a lot better job of actually getting people to grow here now.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was quite a rant. Hopefully that was interesting to you.
No, that landed. The spaceship definitely landed there. One number of things. One thing, I think the sort of critical theory stuff is maybe they have a sense of mystery, and that mystery is only orientated towards the reduction of harm, and it doesn't have that other end of the spectrum, which is increasing potential, and in fact quite the opposite. So that I think that's an interesting perspective, and I always like to give the devil his due, and that's often said in the favor of some right-wing perspective. But I think it's interesting to give it in the context of what I understand of critical theory and these things, and they're speaking a lot about trauma, and the language that they use is very, very reflective on things like polyvagal theory, which again, as I said earlier, it's not quite clear how scientific that is, but it's very interesting that they're at least the sort of intention of origin is like, we have to recognize the reality of internal experiences and how this influences action in the world, and then they take, I think, quite far this sort of, there's obviously a truth to this sort of victim. If I'm in a traumatized state, my possible actions are going to be much more limited than someone who is not in that traumatized state. Yeah. They make many errors, but I think that is a very reasonable supposition. But yeah, it's, I mean, again, like descriptive, prescriptive, like there's some merit to some of these ideas, and then when I don't think we need to go down there, and I'm not educated enough to really speak more on this topic. But yeah, I think within the it's a really interesting point that if we radically change our environment, we will change radically who we are, because we are so connected to our environment. Peterson made a really interesting point recently that there's a sort of bi-directional, the genes affect consciousness, and consciousness affects genes, in the sense of the types of mates that are chosen naturally will affect the types of will naturally affect the genetic offspring. If we select for like the most aggressive person, we're going to get the most aggressive person. But he makes the point that in nature, it's often the most reciprocal individual who is at the top of the hierarchy, and you don't find that many hierarchies of force. You find more sort of hierarchies of like social competence, right?
Yeah.
And just to round that one off, that the implication of this is that our genetics are perhaps shaped with the ancestry of sort of social competence, so that there is some sort of like almost like genetic moral blueprint of like social reciprocation, and a value for community. And I think this is also a sort of challenge of the I guess kind of like neoliberal perspective, that we're all kind of at war with each other, and the state of nature is life is short, nasty, brutish and short, something like that. That there's actually the reality of that is that we're
British,
more
nasty, and short. That's Hobbes.
Hobbes, right? But I believe that that's the sort of founding philosophy of the neoliberal attitude of kind of greed is good and trickle down. But
that's like objectivism, and Ayn Rand is the idea that essentially, I mean, the idea is that naked self-interest ultimately orients us towards something that creates the good through the mechanism of market capitalism, which I think is partially true, and also also contains some major missing pieces.
But it's interesting that the presupposition there is seemingly erroneous, at least contrasted to this frame that the ancestors that survived were the most socially reciprocal or socially competent one. That they're not this sort of power hierarchy.
Have you read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind?
No, I'm aware of Haidt.
Yeah, very good book. But he talks about this. He gives a very beautiful sort of breakdown of why the assumption of Homo economicus is false.
Right.
So highly recommend that. Well, we've been on for 2 hours and 20 minutes now, and I feel like you and I could go on, and I'm sure we will. But we should probably end this for now because the audience only has so much attention.
Yes,
I'm not yet Joe Rogan,
sure.
but yeah, this is really enjoyable, and I look forward to future conversations, Flynn. And any closing words, or how can people find you? What should they know about you?
Main two ventures, the exploration group, which we didn't get to speak about, which is something very interesting and strange and wonderful that I put together, which is essentially a group exploring the application of scientific principles.
Mm-hmm.
And the exploration element is the uncertainty of how they can be applied.
Yeah.
So we're taking this bottom-up approach of here are some things that are true about the world. What can we do with them?
Yeah.
And it's a really wonderful thing. So you can check that out on flyndisney.com/the exploration group. Each word is hyphenated.
Nice.
And I have the Bridge with Flynn Disney podcast, which is on its first episode with Daniel Ilabaka, who's a fascinating specimen. So all of these things you can find on my Instagram. There's a link tree in the bio, so you can click that and find these things. And I think the next exploration group, so we run these sort of every 2 months or so. The block is about 6 to 8 weeks, and the next one I believe we're going to be doing on adaptation as a concept and kind of exploring this idea. So
Nice. Very cool. Well, thank you very much for being on the podcast, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, likewise, man.
Hey, you've reached the end of another Evolve Move Play podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, if you want to be involved in the conversation, please consider joining us in our new membership subscription so you can get access to question and answers with our live speakers once a month, question and answers with me once a month, and a dedicated forum to discuss everything going on in the podcast, as well as a general discussion of movement on our general movement forums. If you're interested in that, make sure to check out the link below, get signed up, and join a part of our membership community. If you can't join our membership community right now, it's still always helpful if you can like, share, and subscribe, and even hit that bell and get notifications for upcoming Evolve Move Play podcasts. But adios for now, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.